This is why she couldn't admit the truth.
You victim in there?
Yes.
You funny a little bit?
It was. We both were laughing about it.
Okay.
And then I fell asleep, totally forgetting that he was in the suitcase.
Did you hear that? We both were laughing about it? When I heard her say that, I had to stop and pause for a second, because that's not just a bad joke. It's a glimpse into something called emotional detachment. Many people simply see a woman making an excuse in front of the officers. She's trying to downplay what happened. But as a therapist, I'm seeing a complete lack of empathic resonance. It's like the part of the brain that should feel the other person's distress is gone offline. We've seen the headlines of this case. This is probably one of the most requested cases that I have received lately to do a clinical breakdown. But we need to talk about the narcissistic injury that likely triggered this entire event. We're going to peel back the victim mask and look at the clinical reason why Sarah could not admit that she did anything wrong. They were just playing a game. This is the beginning of Sarah's victim mask. I'm going to do a clinical breakdown of cognitive dissonance. And we're going to talk about Darvo and the malignant narcissism. That's coming up. When I look at the case like this, I see a textbook display of externalization of blame and cognitive dissonance. Sarah has built a reality where she's the hero and the victim at the same time, but never the villain. Today, we're going deep into the Sarah Boone clinical file to see how these two identities can't coexist without a total break from reality. By the end of this clinical breakdown, you'll understand the red flags of the pathological defensiveness. And by spotting these red flags, you can use them to protect your own boundaries when dealing with a high conflict personality. I bet you have one or two of those that you have come in contact with. I'm John Cordray, a licensed professional counselor. I've been doing this since 2007. I want to make clear that everything that I say in this video is my speculations based on public records and behaviors that I observe. It's not a diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. All right, let's dive into this clinical file of Sarah Boone. Sarah created a reality where she is the hero and the victim, but never the villain. It's a paradox where the perpetrator builds an internal reality holding absolute moral high ground while remaining quietly defensiveness on the inside. She's the hero on one side and she's the victim on the other side, but never the villain in between. She's not going to admit it. And the result, it's the opposing realities that can't coexist without a total break from reality. That's what we call cognitive dissonance and a total externalization of blame. It's not my fault. We were just playing a game. I didn't know what was going to happen. I fell asleep. Before we get into her past, we have to look at how Sarah's mind processes information in the moment. In my practice, I often see what we call cognitive distortions. These are essentially glitches in the thinking that convinces us of something that's not really true. We don't have the evidence, and so we sometimes manufacture it. For Sarah, the biggest one that she is exhibiting is emotional reasoning. This is the I feel it, therefore it must be true trap. If Sarah feels like George is being annoying, then in her mind, he is objectively a monster who deserves to be punished. There's no middle ground here. This leads to a concept called splitting, which is a core feature of many high conflict personalities. People are either all good or all bad. There's no in between. Emotions override objective reality. It turns people into problems to be solved. They're problems. The split happens with the emotional reasoning. I feel it, therefore it's objectively true. The emotional reaction becomes the only source of truth. It's all good. But then the split happens. The empathy switch turns off. The moment a partner becomes a source of frustration, they are categorized as 100% bad. They're terrible. They need to go. You're no longer interacting with a human. You're interacting with a problem. And George was a problem for Sarah. Well, at least that's what she thought. When George was playing the game of hide and seek, at that time he might have been good in Sarah's eyes. But the moment he became the source of her frustration, he was split into the all bad category. Once someone is bad in a split mind, the empathy switches off. It's no longer there. You're no longer zipping up a boyfriend. You're zipping up a problem. I want you to think about that. How dangerous is it when your emotions become your only source of truth? It's like driving the car where the windshield is just a mirror reflecting your own face. You aren't really seeing the road. You're only seeing your own reaction to it. Next, I want to talk about the developmental blueprint. When people look at a blue suitcase, they see what was used to commit the crime. They see a singular, horrific night in Winter Park. It was horrible, I'm sure, for George. But as a therapist, when I look at the years, the thousands of days leading up to that moment, I don't see a snap. I see what we call a compulsion to repeat. This wasn't just some sudden detour into darkness. It wasn't just boom. It wasn't a snap. It was a crescendo that lasted many, many, many days. It's a long, slow climb up a mountain of maladaptive coping mechanisms. For Sarah, when things got hard or when she felt even a flicker of rejection, her go-to move wasn't resolution. And it wasn't, let's sit down and talk about this. It was retaliation. Now, I want to pause here for a second. I want to be careful here. When I say retaliation, I'm talking about the psychological defense. It's a way to feel powerful when you actually feel small. In those many, many moments of confrontation between George and Sarah, there was a lot of times, I'm sure, that she felt small. And so the psychological defense is, I want to get back and get even. It's a self-defense mechanism. When we look at the historical domestic calls between Sarah and George, we see a pattern that would make any clinician's heart sink. There were dozens of police interactions, and arrests were made on both sides. They were not angels, to say the least. That crescendo was a long climb up a mountain of maladaptive coping, and eventually it exploded into retaliation. You can see this mountain that was climbing and building. The he said, she said reports, and there were physical bruises and arrest, and then, boom, retaliation. She couldn't take it anymore. It's the compulsion to repeat. This behavior pattern requires a brutal cycle of endless police interactions and domestic calls. Believe me, that night, that day, when the police arrived at Sarah's place and Sarah was talking to the police on the body cams about what happened, you better believe the police already knew about Sarah. And when she was faced with rejection, the psychological go-to move is never resolution. She wasn't trying to work it out. Maybe it'll get better. It was a reaction, a retaliation to feel powerful when she felt small. It was her chance. Most people may look at this case and look at their relationship, and they might ask, why didn't they just leave each other? Why in the world would they stay in the fire They fought all the time, tooth and nail. But it's not that simple of an answer. They were caught in a brutal cycle of traumatic bonding. Think about that term for a second. It sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? Bonding usually implies something healthy, something warm. But a traumatic bond, a trauma bond, is forged in the heat of the betrayal bond cycle and is fueled by intermittent reinforcement. You have these explosive, terrifying fights followed by these intense periods of makeup where the relief feels like love, but it's not love. It's neurochemistry in action. Your brain gets addicted to the high of the reconciliation after the low of the battle. You get used to it. And sometimes you expect it. And that battle becomes a high conflict loop. That loop looks something like this. Conflict becomes the only currency for intimate connection. The trauma bonding is forged in a betrayal cycle fueled by intermittent reinforcement. And the brain gets addicted to the neurochemical makeup high following the battle low. Intensity is fatally mistaken for intimacy. This is the high reconciliation and relief. They both go in cycles. That's the trauma bond that they were experiencing. Sarah wasn't just stuck in a bad relationship. She was stuck in a psychological feedback loop where conflict, the raw, high-stakes conflict, the verbal abuse, and even physical abuse, was the only way she knew how to truly connect. I know that's a lot to wrap your head around. For a lot of you, this type of relationship is foreign. But I know some of you know exactly what this is like. It's actually counterintuitive. Why would anyone want to connect through the pain? But in Sarah's world, intensity was mistaken for intimacy. And in high conflict relationships, that's exactly what happens. You have these explosions, and then you have these reconciliation moments, and that feels like intimacy, but it's not. It's the loop that I just talked about. Conflict was the only currency that she had to spend. If things were quiet, she likely felt invisible. If things were peaceful, she probably felt unsafe, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But let's dig a little deeper into why she stayed in that traumatic bond for so long. It often goes back to a disorganized attachment. In this blueprint, the person you love is also the person you fear. It creates this constant state of approach avoidance. You want to be close, but the closeness feels like engulfment. Here's what that looks like. Intimacy triggers a constant push and pull between abandonment and engulfment. There's the approach avoidance where craving closeness actually feels like you're losing your sense of self. Object relations theory talks about the mental images of others that are perceived as threatening. The only defense is to establish dominance and become the primary threat first. Both the approach and the avoidance are fueled by the fear of abandonment. It's like stay away but come close at the same time. That's the fear of engulfment. For someone with Sarah's psychological makeup, intimacy can feel like you're losing your entire self, your identity. And to prevent being engulfed by George, she had to constantly assert her power. She had to stay one up on him. This is why we see so much reactive aggression in domestic reports. It wasn't just about the argument of the day. It was about the deep-seated, likely subconscious need to keep him at a distance, while also being terrified of him leaving. It's what we call object relations theory that I just talked about in that last graphic. If her internal objects, like the mental images that she has of others, if they're all threatening or they're all unreliable, then her only defense is to become the primary threat herself. She's essentially playing a lifelong game of, I'll hurt you way before you can hurt me. When you view the world through that lens, a suitcase isn't just a crime. It's a preventative strike, a tool used as a weapon. This is where we have to look at the concept of object constancy. In a healthy mind, you know that even if you're fighting with someone, they still care about you and the relationship is stable, even though you are in a conflict. Ultimately, you know you love one another. But for someone with a distorted attachment, that constancy is missing. When the fight starts, the other person becomes the enemy. Enemy number one. They are no longer a person. They are a threat to your ego. And when you're fighting an enemy, you don't seek a compromise. You seek to win. In Sarah's mind, the suitcase wasn't just a container for George. Psychologically, it was a container for all of those years of perceived slights, all of the time she felt that she had been wronged. That suitcase served as a psychological container for years of fights and years of perceived slights, the put-downs. In a disordered mind, an argument transforms a loved one into an absolute enemy with no redeeming history. Zipping the bag ensures a win in the years-long argument. She becomes the passive observer of his accident. By zipping that bag, she was finally winning the argument that had been going on for years. She had enough. She was finally the one in control of the narrative. This is the ultimate expression of externalization of blame. In her narrative, George put himself in there by being a certain way. She was just the passive observer of his accident. I fell asleep. It was an accident. It's a terrifying level of cognitive disassociation. She could film him, hear his distress, and yet, because of this blueprint of retaliation, she could stay detached. She wasn't seeing a human being in distress. She was likely seeing a problem that had finally been resolved. Finally, it's over. I know. It's a lot to take in. It's heavy and it's dark. And I want you to know that it's okay if you need to take a second to process that. This isn't a movie. This isn't a drama. This is true crime. This actually happened. And it happens more than you want to think about. We're talking about the total breakdown of human empathy in favor of ego protection. It's a lot of heavy lifting for the brain to understand how someone gets so far into this point, the point of no return. Hey friends, if you're finding these clinical breakdowns helpful for understanding these complex and often tragic human dynamics, please consider joining as a member of the channel and get some great perks along the way. This next phase is the behavioral breakdown. We talked about narcissism, but we need to talk about the malignant side of that spectrum. Malignant narcissism is a cocktail of narcissism, antisocial behavior, and this is the key, it's also paranoia. When you watched her in that interrogation room,
Oh, good. I got him in there. Now I'm going to go to sleep? Is that what you all are assuming?
Well, it's not an assumption when that's what you told us that happened.
That's what happened.
did you see how she constantly was looking for the trap? She's not just defending herself. She's suspicious of every move the detectives make. This isn't just a criminal suspicion. It's a clinical paranoia. She believes there's a conspiracy against her because, in her mind, she is too special to have made this mistake. Her behavior is egocentric. This is a fancy way of saying her behaviors are in sync with her ego. She doesn't feel gross or guilty about what she did because her actions align perfectly with her self-image of a woman who was wronged, and she fought back, finally. This is the toxic intersection that fuels the pathological defensiveness. There's narcissism, there is antisocial behavior, and then there's paranoia. And when the three of them converge, it becomes malignant. There's a little bit of all three of those in this malignant personality. This is why clinical intervention is so hard in these cases. If a patient doesn't feel like their behavior is a problem, they really have no motivation to change. To Sarah, the only problem in that room was the detectives that wouldn't agree with her. How dare they not believe her and question her? Now, I want us to really lean in and look at that interrogation footage, because this is where the victim mask doesn't just slip, it starts to crumble. Pay attention to how Sarah reacts to that crumbling.
The video shows that he can knock it out on his own.
But when I unzipped it with one finger.
From the outside.
But it had the hole in it.
And you're claiming that it had a paper clip, so that's what assisted you in doing it.
No.
Is what you told us.
You were able to unzip it from the outside very easily, because that's the way they're designed.
But you could on the inside too.
Why wouldn't he have gotten himself out if he could?
I don't know. I don't know if you saw where the hole was. I don't know.
I didn't see a hole.
No one
I didn't
sees
see
a
no
hole.
fingers
You're the
sticking
only
out.
one that's...
Please do not assume.
I'm not assuming. I haven't assumed anything. I follow evidence.
And when the detectives start to press her, she doesn't weep with remorse. Instead, she does something much more clinically fascinating. She starts intellectualizing. Watch how she treats the detectives. She's not just answering their questions. She's trying to manage them. She's correcting their grammar, questioning their intent, their assumptions, and using precise intellectual words to describe the situation as she saw it. Logic and clinical language act as a buffer against crushing shame. The primal and barbaric reality hits against the shield. By using big words and correcting grammar and managing the detectives creates a psychological buffer zone. That's the fragile ego. The goal is to outsmart the interrogation, to win the intellectual argument, and completely escape the moral reality and responsibility. She was essentially tidying up the attic of her mind. This is a classic defense mechanism. In therapy, we see intellectualization when a person's fragile ego simply can't handle the sheer crushing weight of the shame of being wrong. By using logic and big words, she creates this buffer between her and her allegations and the charge against her. She's trying to move the conversation from the floor of the apartment where a man lost his life into the attic of her mind. She was tidying up where everything is justifiable. She's trying to outsmart the interrogators because if she can just win the intellectual argument, she thinks she can escape the moral reality and be found innocent. But then the detectives do something she didn't prepare for. They show her the video, her own video. I'm not going to show it here, but it's out there. And she made the video. This is where we see a textbook display of DARVO. If you're not familiar with that acronym, it stands for Deny, Attack, and Reverse Victim and Offender. It's a strategy used by high conflict or disordered personalities when they are caught red-handed. High conflict personalities, they try to rewrite history in real time when they're caught. They deny it. They claiming no intent. They attack, assailing the victim's past and character. They reverse victim and offender, flipping reality so she was forced to act. Every piece of evidence is flipped. She preserves her own self-image in this. It's a tactic. Splitting the world into good self and bad other again. She first denies intent, then almost instantly she shifts to attacking George's character. She starts bringing up his past, his drinking, his supposed failures, as if his flaws somehow justify the suitcase coffin. Now, it does appear that George wasn't an innocent person. He had his own demons in his closet. Maybe not even a real nice guy sometimes. But she's trying to literally rewrite the history in real time right there in the plastic chair in the interrogation room. It's a tragic, almost surreal display of personality fragmentation. She's splitting the world into good Sarah and bad George. Every piece of evidence that suggests she might be the offender is immediately flipped. In her mind, she's not the person who zipped the bag, not intentionally. She's the person who was forced to zip the bag by his actions. It's a total reversal of reality to preserve her own self-image. There's a moment in that interrogation, it's very brief, where she almost smirks. You probably heard me talk about this phenomenon before. It's called duping delight. It's that tiny subconscious flash of pleasure someone gets when they think they have successfully deceived an authority figure. It's a tell that her moral compass is functioning on a completely different frequency. We also have to consider pseudological fantastica. It's a fancy way of saying pathological lying. These lies are often complex, grandiose, and, this is the important part, the person often begins to believe them themselves. The brain deletes reality and then replaces it to ensure the ego survives at all cost. It's where reality and the fantasy self collide and crack. They don't quite fit. Pathological lying is a way of life. It results in the building a complete fantasy self. When evidence threatens the ego, the brain weaves a replacement narrative. When she talks about how everyone knows how good of a person she is amping up that fantasy self. When that fantasy is challenged by a video of her mocking a dying man, the cognitive dissonance, which is the mental pain of holding two opposing ideas, is so great that her brain literally has to delete the reality in order to survive. She isn't just lying to the cops. She's desperately trying to save her fantasy self from drowning. I actually had to stop the footage for a second when I saw this part.
But my intention was not, again, oh good, I got him in there, now I'm just going to go to sleep.
What do you think someone that knows nothing about this or hears just a little bit like, oh, they were playing around in a suitcase
She's been drinking
and then watches
probably
that
went
video?
to sleep. That's what happened.
It's so jarring. If you're starting to see how these patterns show up, not just in high-profile cases like this one, but in everyday high-conflict people we all deal with at some point in our life, then you're starting to understand the why behind the headlines. Hey friends, if you want to keep looking past the surface with me every week, karate chop that subscribe button. I want to pivot here for a second because there's a clinical insight that I think most people miss, and it's the most dark part of all. When you watch Sarah's face, her indignation, it doesn't look fake, does it? She seems genuinely offended that they are questioning her. And that's because in a very real clinical sense, she likely believes her own lies. This is the power of confabulation that we just talked about. When the truth is too painful or too damaging to the ego, the brain doesn't just hide the truth, it actually replaces it. It fills the gaps with the narrative that keeps the ego safe. Her brain was likely working overtime to weave a story where she is the misunderstood hero of her own tragedy. She's not just lying to the cops. She's been lying to herself for so long that the lie has become her primary reality. Think about the psychological exhaustion in that. To live in a world where you have to constantly patch the holes in your story with new fantasies just to keep from falling apart. It's why she gets so angry when the detectives point out a contradiction. You aren't just pointing out a lie, you're threatening her entire sense of self. To Sarah, zipping that suitcase wasn't an act of malice. It was an act of justice in a world she had already completely reimagined. We're now moving into the final piece of this puzzle, and it's something I don't think anyone has really addressed yet. What happens when the mask finally and permanently falls off? One last concept before we wrap up Sarah's clinical file. It's the difference between cognitive empathy and affect empathy. Sarah has plenty of cognitive empathy. She knows how people expect her to feel. She knows how to say it was an accident or I'm a good person. She understands that concept of emotion pretty well, but she lacks affect empathy. It's that ability to actually feel what another person is feeling. When George was screaming for his life and pushing out and trying to get out of that suitcase, she could understand that he was in distress. That's cognitive. But she couldn't feel his pain. That's affective. Knowing how to sound empathetic is fundamentally different from feeling human pain. For cognitive empathy, it's knowing what others feel rather than really trying to understand. Affective empathy is the ability to actually feel the other person's pain. Most of you have affective empathy. You feel sorry when someone is hurting. It's a connection, human to human. But cognitive empathy is much different. It's simply knowing how people expect you to feel. I understand you're in distress. I get it that people think I should have empathy. See the difference? As we step back from the clinical file of Sarah Boone, I think we need to talk about the macro lesson here, because this isn't just one woman and a suitcase in Florida. The Sarah Boone case teaches us one very hard clinical truth. Accountability is the ultimate kryptonite for a disordered personality. In the world of psychology, we often talk about something called the internal locus of control. I know it sounds like academic jargon, but it's actually a very simple, very human concept. It's a degree to which you believe you have power over your own life. If you have an internal locus, you believe your choices matter. If you mess up, you own it. You fix it. You move on. Ask for forgiveness. Apologize. But for someone like Sarah, she operates almost entirely from an external locus of control. Accountability is something that she does not want. The internal locus says, my choices matter, and I own my mistakes. The external locus says, things happen to me. It's the world's fault, the lawyer's fault, the weather's fault. The existential terror is the fragmented ego. Admitting I messed up equates to I made a mistake and I'm not going to do that. In her reality, things don't just happen because of her. They happen to her. The suitcase didn't happen because she zipped it. It happened because George got in it, or because he made her angry, or because the police aren't listening correctly. When a person lacks that internal anchor, the suitcase is never their fault. It's the world's fault. It's the prosecution's fault. It's the lawyer's fault. It's the weather's fault. It has to be. Or maybe it's even the dog's fault. I've sat across from people in my practice who often struggle with this. Not to this extreme, thankfully, but the pattern is the same. There is a profound, almost desperate terror of someone saying the words, I messed up. It can be embarrassing. You're admitting a weakness. Because for someone with a fragile, fragmented ego, I messed up doesn't mean I made a mistake. To them, it means I am a mistake. It's that existential threat they don't want to admit. Think about the psychological armor you have to wear to live like that. The psychological armor says to refuse is to be wrong, and it creates an impenetrable defense mechanism. And the ultimate cost, if you can never be wrong, you can never be healed. And you're in a permanent state of war with yourself. You are trapped. That's a powerful statement. If you can't be wrong, then you can't be healed. In a way, Sarah was in her own suitcase, just invisible. That's why we see Sarah become so indignant, so offended by the evidence. The evidence isn't just a legal problem for her, it's a psychological assault on her identity as a good person. It's a powerful and honestly a very sobering reminder for all of us. Mental health, true deep down clinical health and well-being, doesn't begin with being perfect. It doesn't begin with always having the right answer or never making a mistake either. Mental health begins with the courage to say, I was wrong. I made a mistake. I'm weak and I need help. When someone consistently blames everyone else for their circumstances and is always the victim of their own stories, you aren't seeing a victim. You're seeing the glaring clinical red flag of pathological defensiveness. We need to recognize the pattern to protect your own peace. It begins with the strain to look at your own actions without the victim mask and say, yep, this is on me. Take ownership for your actions and your behaviors and what you say. That's where the healing starts. But as we've seen in this case, when you refuse that first step, you end up zipping yourself into a psychological suitcase of your own making. You become a prisoner of your own narrative long before the cell door ever slams shut. I know this was a lot to process. We've gone from interrogation rooms to the deepest parts of the human psyche today. But when you're out in the world, or maybe even in your own family, and you see someone who is constantly blaming everyone else for their circumstances, someone who is always the victim of every story they tell, what do you see? Do you see a person who needs your help and your pity? Or are you starting to see the clinical red flag of a victim mask? Because once you start seeing the patterns, you can't unsee them. And that's the first step toward protecting your own peace. If this deep dive into the victim mask of Sarah and the mechanics of accountability was eye-opening for you, then you need to check out my next clinical breakdown in this video. When you see someone constantly blaming everyone else for their circumstances, do you see a victim or do you see a glaring red flag? That's something to think about.